be financially sound, earn more than you spend, and pretty much everything will take care of itself. I would have a bipartisan cabinet. I would draw upon both members of both parties, the moderates, who are going to be able to work together, and we get over our differences.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Andrés Bernal, a MMT advocate, MMT researcher and lecturer and policy advisor. We've had conversations in the past, mainly through my videos on modern monetary theory, something that I have been promoting and heavily reading into myself over the past year and a half. And today I decided to bring Andrés on because there is a video going viral everywhere called The Changing World Order, produced by the billionaire Ray Dalio. And that video on YouTube has over 14 million views, I believe. And it's staggering and frightening because that video is filled with misinformation, terrible economic history, and just terrible understanding of money. And the mistakes in that video are very obvious to anyone who has studied either Keynesian economics and especially modern monetary theory, because that video is filled with very dangerous presuppositions and policy implications. And we'll be going over that one by one and why that video is wrong and its various preconceptions. And this will help you as a listener notice when people make similar arguments and assumptions and how to debunk them. But without further ado, before we get into that, Andrés, would you like to introduce yourself and plug your work?
Hey, yeah, great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here on your show. It's a real pleasure. I've deeply enjoyed your videos on MMT. I use them for my classes because I think it's some of the best stuff on the internet right now on the subject. So, I'm a professor lecturer at CUNY, the City University, New York. I am finalizing my doctorate at the New School in Public Policy, and I've been kind of, spending the last 4 years or so traveling around, speaking on progressive economics and MMT, mostly around climate change and climate policy, both in the United States, but I've also spent some time in Europe and in South America discussing these subjects as well. So it's something that I'm really passionate about. I speak to organizations and social movements and people kind of interested in social and economic justice more broadly and how to connect their goals with a policy and macroeconomic framework. I also advise campaigns. I kind of got myself started when I was part of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's campaign. And I was one of her senior policy advisors, which led to conversations that would eventually put forward the Green New Deal resolution in Congress. So that's kind of mostly what I spend my time doing. I mean, I'm also kind of an immigrant here in the United States, Colombian born, arrived here when I was about 4 years old. So that kind of international perspective has also shaped a lot of my thinking. I'm a research fellow with the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity, fellow with the Post Growth Institute, and I am an associate editor with the Money on the Left editorial collective. And most recently, I've become executive director of an initiative called Public Money Action, which is an advocacy and policy 501c4 that is kind of making moves on spreading knowledge and organizing around public money.
That's awesome. You must be really happy with the recent news on the Colombian election.
Yeah. It was a truly kind of beautiful moment yesterday. I think a lot of people were going in cautious and even a bit pessimistic, and we pulled through in the end. That election is something I'd been invested in for quite some time, including the last time that Gustavo Petro ran for president. I was part of a team that brought him to DC to speak with and meet with several members of the Progressive Congressional Caucus, and we also spoke to some union leadership, some U.S. union leadership. So I've been quite involved in that as well, and in talks on some rethinking of macroeconomic policy from the Latin American perspective. So it's very exciting, but we also have like the hard work ahead of us there.
Mm-hmm. And that election signals something, a trend that's been happening in Latin America, sort of a rebirth of the pink tide, almost like a pink tide 2.0. And that signals a changing world order, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And Ray Dalio, his video that has grossed over 14 million views, which is scary considering how misleading this video is. And I've seen it being shared everywhere. Is really relevant to just this discussion on the changing world order, but also the recent talks about inflation, supply chain crisis, and generally what's causing inflation. And this video is filled with so many mistakes. It's about 40 minutes long, so I'm sure we're not going to be able to critique all of it. But we'll go over the points one by one, and Andres, bringing his MMT perspective and knowledge of MMT, provide thorough debunking. But first, I should maybe point out as to who Ray Dalio is. Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund investor. He's in charge of one of the most successful investing firms called Bridgewater. So that's worth understanding his class perspective, first of all. But he really has invested in putting out this video that promotes what I would say are pretty conventional neoclassical economic views, actually even some border like Austrian school type of views too when it comes to money. And his view, I would suggest watching the video for yourself after you listen to this podcast, but his message is really essentially that societies that spend more money than they take in will collapse and will lead to inflation and will lead to bond vigilantes, as people people will want to borrow that currency less of that country. There'll be people selling their bonds, and then the country will have no money. They'll run out of their own currency. Well, yeah, he tries to use sort of this idea, vaguely speaking, to explain why there's a cycle of why nations succeed and fail. And all sort of problems with this, but the first, I think we can debunk this video by debunking first the preconceptions in Ray Dalio's economic thinking. And one of the most glaring assumptions of Ray Dalio's analysis is that governments function like households. And he says this repeatedly, saying that it is essential for governments to be financially sound and earn more than they spend, and that they must get more money in than than essentially treating it like a business. Andres, what is wrong with viewing governments like households?
Yeah, it's a great question to get started with. I think, like, first of all, but really quick before I get to that, what's important is that Dallio's video is really well animated and it looks really cool. So you can tell that a lot was invested into putting that together. And he offers this narrative about why countries, as you mentioned, why countries succeed and fail. And it's kind of part of trends throughout history. It has a bit of a historical perspective to it. So that in and of itself, I think, is captivating and somewhat of an important framing. But it's once you start listening to the content of the analysis itself that it's totally just off the rails and inaccurate and problematic. But it's kind of, I think, that initial context that lures people in a moment of so much uncertainty like what we have today. So yeah, I think the
PragerU effect with the animation and the misinformation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. He also presents it kind of like in a very non-threatening way, which may be the difference with PragerU, who immediately have that very aggressive right-wing spin to it. But he kind of tries to present this as like, I'm just a nice guy. I've succeeded. I've accomplished all of this. And look, I've studied history and I've spent thousands of hours trying to understand, what's going on, and I figured it out, and I have all these cool charts to show for it. So that's what's going on. And when I took a look at the comments in the video, I mean, people seem completely enthralled by it, and they're like thanking him and, having these like deep, what they perceive as like these deep epiphanies. And one guy was like, wow, like what an age we live in where we can have access to this kind of knowledge for free at our disposal, right? Like truly intense stuff.
We all know that the more graphs there are and the more lines there are, the more accurate it is.
Exactly. But right, like I also had the experience that right away I started noticing like these huge assumptions that he makes that drive his analysis forward, which he never explains or legitimizes, and he just keeps going, and that's that, right? So to get started, then one of them is that, of course, governments should manage their budget and their finances like a household. And I think this appeals very intuitively to people because they have to, or we have to manage our budgets and our finances in particular ways. And we live in households oftentimes. And we feel the responsibility and the pressure of having to do that a certain kinds of ways. Furthermore, we're in a cultural moment where all of the pressure to have some kind of economic stability falls on families or individuals personally to know the right skills or the right kind of have the right education to be able to be okay in life, right? Increasingly, there's like all this pressure on schools and kids to have to learn finances, so that could be a solution to inequality and to poverty and things like this. So that's another reason I think that it appeals. And so, of course, the next step would be to say, well, these people in the government don't want to manage their finances responsibly, but I have to, so there's something absolutely wrong there. But as we know from any kind of serious economic analysis, and particularly from an MMT perspective, a government is not a household, particularly because there's a qualitatively different relationship and set of responsibilities, insofar that we as people use and have participate with whatever currency is dominant in a society or in a country, and we cannot issue that currency ourselves. Like we can't make that currency. That's illegal, right? That's counterfeiting. We respond to certain kind of macroeconomic conditions and flows of currency and different transactions and contracts and all of this stuff that's coordinated today mostly by corporate America and by banks. But even overarching all of them is the legal framework. There has to be a payment system. There has to be a set of laws, a set of understandings of how all of this can function. To all of the banks that give us all of the loans that all businesses depend on, including the most powerful businesses out there, they have to be given charters and licenses and insurance and all kinds of things, right? And all of this comes from a source, which is the constitutional authority of the federal government, who don't passively participate with the currency. They actually are the source of that currency. And they chose a unit of account, as we call it, which is the dollar. And their institutions are the ones that produce that currency. They don't have to go find that currency in nature or something like that, or in spontaneous markets or in a spontaneous economy that just came out of nowhere. They organized all of this thing when they formed the United States of America as a political entity. And a part of that in the Constitution is the ability to use the tools of fiscal policy to spend money and to have a currency itself. So their responsibility is to responsibly manage the macro economy, not their budget in the same way that we have to.
So you're telling me the U.S. dollar wasn't invented through barter autonomously? It wasn't the U.S. government who made the U.S. dollar? That can't be possible.
Exactly right, and that's
It's from taxes. You tax people. That's how you get the money, and then the people get the money by other people. Wait a second.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't take much thinking, right? But I understand why people view instinctively money as households, because, it's sometimes people say that, the family is the first cell of society or whatever. And we've been conditioned to think in family terms because it's a simple narrative, right? But you'd think that a guy who spent so much time researching economic history couldn't think the basic fact of where does the money come from? How on earth could governments run out of their own currency, which is part of the other big thing. A big theme in his video is that the government borrows money, and that we have to make sure that that powers will decline when there's no one who wants to lend that currency. If the government relies too much on borrowed money, it risk going bankrupt, right? He kind of treats it like a business. What actually happens with government bonds? Like, what are government bonds? Does the government, do sovereign currency issuers actually borrow money when they issue bonds?
Right. So, one of the things I noticed too is that he makes this interesting leap from talking about the gold standard and explaining the idea that money needs to be backed or was at one point backed by something, by gold, and he seems to kind of like be a supporter of the gold standard as like what makes money sound and be valuable. And I guess that's a different question that we can explore. But in making that leap to talking about the moments in history where we got off the gold standard, which he completely ignores the Depression and World War II and how so investing money into the economy was instrumental to save the world from total collapse and fascism. Totally glosses over that. But then he continues this narrative that one of the main factors in a nation collapsing is that they borrow too much money. But of course, logically speaking, if an entity issues a particular unit of account, which again is a legal instrument of measuring debts and obligations, it's not an actual thing, right? There are things we use as symbols to represent money, like a dollar bill or a coin, or just like official numbers on a computer screen, or checks, or all kinds of things, right? But that is not like money itself. Like all of those things are part of an infrastructure, a legal infrastructure that keep records and accounts of things. So if you're the entity that chose that unit of account, that is kind of the scorekeeper of that unit of account, you don't need why would you need to borrow your own money? Like, you're the source. So just logically speaking, there you don't borrow your own money. What confuses people is that we have this institutional process in place where when we deficit spend, we simultaneously have this relationship between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, where they issue Treasury securities, and as a consequence of that process, which I'll explain in a second, an account goes up. Numbers in an account go up, and that number has been called the national debt. And so the way it's framed in the mainstream and in conventional thinking is like, oh yeah, when we deficit spend, we need to get that money, and if we don't have it from taxing, we'll borrow it from banks or from wealthy people, and they give us that money, and then we can use that money to spend. But then we owe them back money with interest, and that's the national debt, right? And there is a certain kind of intuitive reason to think that that's true if you don't have kind of a background explanation for what money is more broadly, and then the kind of details of how operationally things actually work, which Dallio doesn't seem to understand or hasn't researched at all. He didn't, for all of his research, he didn't actually go into central bank operations and what they actually do. Or there's a lot of things one can read about that as well. So
he didn't ask the basic questions.
He didn't ask the basic questions, right? He didn't ask the basic questions, and people like Dallio are oftentimes in contexts where they get the same kind of ideology when they do quote unquote research. It's policy and economics that is just going to justify the ideology he's always carrying with him. And given that he's a very, very wealthy, powerful billionaire investor, I mean, as you said, right, like he's coming from a certain position in society where there's less of an incentive to ask deeper questions about structural causes of inequality and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, and it's worth
Yeah.
one thing it's worth saying is this is why I started off my deficit myth video by saying we still believe in the divine right of kings. And the reason why I think it's so important to look at that is because historically humans have gone through periods where we're very smart in certain areas. You'll have people in society who do research on history, mathematics, discover so many things and not question basic things like whether the earth is flat, right? But, Copernicus came around, questioned that, and people doubted him. And I'm sure people way before him also questioned that and were laughed at, right? Of course the earth is flat. What are you talking about? And, this is why I think it's worth having that in context, because now sometimes people will look at MMT and say, how could this be real? If this was real, wouldn't everybody know this? And well, actually, many times in society, everybody didn't know anything about certain basic facts. So we're very capable of, not realizing certain facts that are, hiding in plain sight.
We are. And it's interesting to note the kind of politics that exist within areas that create knowledge. For example, like economic knowledge, economic sciences, and whatnot. Something that's kind of funny is the mainstream, which is often called orthodox economics, neoclassical economics, what have you. They will call outside heterodox perspectives flat earthers. It kind of using the same rhetorical strategy to say what you're saying is complete madness and making a claim on science that they have themselves. But of course, part of their politics is to hide all of the ideology and the political interests and the total lack of intellectual rigor, and also philosophical rigor, because we're talking about a social science, right? We're not just talking about, why does a ball fall and where is it, what's the acceleration and the velocity of different things. We're talking about human institutional systems. So there's all kinds of assumptions and projections onto quote unquote economic science, which actively tries to marginalize and keep out perspectives that are, for example, much more interdisciplinary, that include like sociology, that include political theory, a study of institutions, anthropology, as one of your videos points out, right, into the more holistic schema of an economic analysis. With that said, when we had a gold standard imposed on most of the world, right, on a kind of global economic system, which that itself also is something that Dallio doesn't talk about. Why did we have a gold standard? What is the history behind the imposition of a gold standard? And if you are a country that does not have a lot of gold, right? Like, if you're basing the entire world order on how much stash you can have, I mean, obviously, it doesn't take much thinking to realize this is very related to war and conquest and just kind of like showing up and colonizing and taking these kind of precious metals or whatever, right? So this is go ahead.
Yeah, well, go on. If you're, it's related.
I was just gonna say, this is just like such a colonial system that created this gold standard, and then they're over here telling us how, like, well, that's the only way to have sound economics, and that's total nonsense, right? But he glosses over that and kind of just assumes that when you had the gold standard backing your money, you were responsible because you had something to back that up. When that was the case, there were a certain kind of relationship between bondholders and our governments, and then our central bank and whatnot, to where it might have felt more like borrowing because there was this relationship to how much gold you had stashed. But of course, once we got off that, because there was just no way to respond to the Depression and to World War II, and then later just the increasing size and complexity of the United States, plus I think it's important to also keep in mind just the kind of Cold War military interests that the U.S. had, that Nixon understood. We would just not be able to do all of these things without a much larger fiscal space that was impossible under a gold standard, because a gold standard is a completely arbitrary imposition of how much you can spend that takes away attention from actual resources that do things, that produce goods and services, or that meet certain social and social needs, and kind of takes that away and creates an arbitrary thing or commodity. I mean, I guess one could see this as like commodifying money and forcing money to act like a market, which has finite and scarce boundaries around it, and a lot of people get left out from that. Basically, let's put it that way, right? People get left out. People get excluded from a system like that, and the consequences of those exclusions are, poverty, are it being basically functionally impossible to respond to something like slavery, and the abolition of slavery, which leaves an entire millions of people completely impoverished. It makes it impossible to respond to a crisis like a recession or a depression. You just can't do these things. So it's a huge problem. But that's kind of justified by, well, we are responsible in our finances, which of course is kind of like a cultural way of saying that elites are responsible for their finances and everybody else is not.
Well, what you mentioned, that the gold standard comes from a very colonial mentality, and I mean that's for sure true, because it makes perfect sense why rich people would like a gold standard, because it gives tangibility to their wealth. Like, of course, if they have all this money, if it's backed up to something real that requires a lot of labor to to extract and have, it gives them, their wealth, a sense of security and real value. Whereas if it's all into paper currency, or in today's terms, digital money, it's much easier to extract their wealth. And the rich, of course, would like a gold standard, and they would, of course, it's in their interest to not believe MMT, because this is where even the Marxists get it wrong, because the Marxists will like to say, oh, look, the governments are all printing money, running deficits. MMT is being put into practice. No, it's not, right? And it's because, yeah, of course, governments print money, but MMT, as the theory as to how money works, would never be acknowledged by the elites, really, because, of course, then you realize, number one, money's arbitrary, and it's construct, and we have no excuse to not give people, provide people with social programs and things like a job guarantee, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So of course it's not in their interest. But also something worth noting that Dallio gets completely wrong is just the economic history, because he goes with the conventional assumption that we always use gold, that humans always use gold, and that we suddenly, it wasn't until Roosevelt and then Nixon when we went off the gold standard. But actually, if you read something like David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, we actually, humans use credit money, quote unquote fake money, before gold money, before commodity money as a whole. Like the earliest money was actually writing, just literally the calculated debts. It's a construct, and there's nothing inherently superior about hard money, other than maybe it makes rich people feel more secure. But as you said, it makes no sense from a macro holistic point of view when it comes to building a society to have a gold standard, because it's an arbitrary limit on how much we can spend. And why would we want that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's why I always emphasize that money is more of like an accounting infrastructure. Going back to the origins of monetary systems, right, in writing, what they were doing were they were creating ledgers, and they were just keeping account of debts and of the obligation that any society would place on people to contribute to that society. Basically it's like, all right, how do we survive? We're humans. We're all connected to one. We're like, not in necessarily like a woo-woo way, but like we're all connected in the sense that we have relationships and we have language. And so we all kind of communicate and we have responsibilities, and it's clearly much for the benefit of everyone if people coordinate together how to solve problems, all of the sorts of things, right? And then, as humans, we have also different drives and conflicts and aggression, but also the capacity to care. All of these things need to be mediated in many different ways. One of those ways is to keep records of social provisioning, of production, of debts, of obligations, etc. And that's money. And the use of any one like finite thing, or like a shell or a rock or a token or later commodity money, it can represent a way to maybe make it simpler to keep track of these debts. But it's kind of this evolution that starts to convince people that, I mean, you'd be surprised how many people actually believe that the gold standard was like the dawn of money from the very beginning. And then a lot of people also think we're still on the gold standard or like that. Yeah, like it blows my mind. A lot of people, people from other countries are like, yeah, I know the US is not on the gold standard, but I wonder if my country's on a gold standard. Like, people don't know, right? And and I like to frame it because, sometimes people say, well, then money is fake or whatever.
Or it's based on faith. That's the thing they like to say.
Or it's based on faith and trust. Right.
And they ignore taxation. That's what that's what creates value for currency. They don't see it that way.
Yeah, right. One thing I think is important, and then I'll try to get back to this question about borrowing, which I promise we'll get to. I mean, like, language, words are not like, you can't like point at a word in a concrete thing. I mean, there are symbols that represent words, but like, language is also a social construct. We've learned and created a system of communication. A law we can point to a bill or a constitution and be like, this is what represents the law, but in the law are a bunch of ideas and agreements and things like that. Similarly with money, there are different things you can point to that are symbols or represent forms of money, but it's all part of a abstract construct that organizes and mediates an economy and must be institutionalized, which, to your point on taxation, right? That's when I keep saying obligations, that's another way of saying taxing, right? Because we can think of taxation as like colonial taxation. We can think of taxation as like democratic understandings that we're all going to contribute in some way or another. And maybe even like future forms of obligations that are more democratic. But the point is, like, you institutionalize these debts and obligations. So it's not just faith and trust in some individuated sense of like, if I just randomly decide to stop trusting the US dollar, and so do 100 of my neighbors, therefore it will just lose its value. No, that's not the way it works. We are all part of a legal system that places obligations on us. If the United States government were to collapse, then yeah, the dollar probably would be in big trouble. But that's not the context we're speaking about here. So
that's also another whole part to debunk. It's like the way he views the dollar as being like what dictates hegemony rather than hegemony being reflected in the dollar. Like
correct.
He seems to think that like you get hegemony and power by having a strong currency rather than it's hegemony that gets you the strong currency. And that's not even all true for all nations. It depends on the type of economy, because he says that, you know, the US could collapse its hegemony if its dollar collapses. And number one, that's just not even what's happening. The US dollar is going up. So he's wrong about that. And he's also
exactly.
And he's also wrong because, like, for example, China, right? China doesn't want a strong currency. Like, it might have a currency that's used, like its currency is used, but in terms of exchange rate, it actually prefers lower exchange rates so it can stay competitive with, you know, Japan, Vietnam, and South Korea, like its competitors. Whereas the USA is an importer, so it wants a stronger currency because it imports more than it exports. It's like not all current. The way he views it is like dollar goes strong, country goes strong. Like he doesn't understand that different countries have their priorities.
Well, and then like there's different approaches. I mean, this is something that's in the inflation chapter in Stephanie. No, it's not the inflation chapter. It's the trade chapter in Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, which I think she explores quite well. And explains perfectly that some countries will use different strategies in order to, you know, compete in this whole global trade system. One of those is weakening or strengthening their currency, as you mentioned, right? And this has different impacts on people, on workers, on unemployment, and that the point is like that's the conversation we should be having. What are the consequences and the impact? Not on like the money, but like on what the money is doing. So we need to be talking about prices. We need to be talking about unemployment and people and you know, workers and wages. The programs that investment can bring or not bring, quality of life, like all of this stuff, people really fetishize. When I got into MMT, one of the first things that I heard was like Nathan Tankis talking about the fetishization of money instead of the fetishizing of commodities, like Marx would say. You know, it's like today we fetishize money. We think there's something like spooky and magical in money. It rises in value and it falls in value. It's worth nothing and then it's worth a lot. You know, as if like
we have to touch on this because he does the same thing that every like gold bug does, and he says how the US dollar is losing value, and he tries to say that this happened ever since 1971, but that's actually the US dollar has been, you know, devaluing since its foundation. Like but he only looks at the part from 71, but not like the larger picture.
Right. And a lot of times, like, what the hell do we mean by, you know, devaluing? Like sometimes, yeah, like $1 buys you less things because the economy is like, I don't know, fucking 100 times bigger or something. It's like, well, more dollars are needed. But people are getting paid more because there's just a significantly larger economy than there was 100, 200 years ago. You know what I mean? And so we kind of just like throw these words around without looking at the context that they're operating in. And so that's a huge problem as well that, you know, just disrupts that neat little narrative about, you know, empires being strong because their currency was strong, but then they spent too much and they collapsed, or, you know, it's quite ridiculous. And I mean, the other point is like
today is also proof that that the value of the currency and inflation are not correlated at all. Like the US dollar is going up while inflation's going up. They're not correlated, but he thinks of it because he still believes the idea. I mean, and we'll get to this too, because there's so much to get to, but like when it comes to inflation, he thinks in his head, the US is printing money, which of course we know they're not actually printing. They type it, but he thinks that like they're printing, and every time you print, each dollar is less and less valuable. I mean, he actually says that, and that's a conventional view, but it's obviously ridiculous.
Right. Also, when he talks about like different countries who were empires and then they're not empires anymore, I mean, and because they lost their reserve currency status and that whole spiel, which again, a lot of the left and a lot of Marxists also kind of buy into, which is really frustrating.
Yeah, a little bit. I noticed that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Great Britain, for example.
I was about to say.
Right, like the pound is no longer the reserve currency, but last time I checked, like all of the changes to the country after the U.S. kind of took over after World War II are significantly for the better, right? Even if
and the U.S. the British pound is worth more. The British pound is still the most valuable currency today, which is crazy.
Yeah, right. Which again, it doesn't mean anything until we look at like, well, it means more to who and what context, and how does trade play with that? What's the role of what are we trading and who gets what? And again, ever since the United Kingdom stopped being the number one reserve currency or whatever, like they still got like a welfare state that greatly increased quality of life. And we're not talking about the Charles Dickens era in Great Britain anymore. Okay. So, right. Like these huge claims are just pretty arbitrary if we don't consider the context.
I mean, it's definitely, his video is a whole process of selection and salience where he, and, omission and emphasis. So like he emphasizes, currency devaluations, but he doesn't look at, either it's willful ignorance or, or outright deception, because he, just the fact alone that the British pound has like the most favorable exchange rate right now. It's the quote unquote it's the currency that's the most valuable, which doesn't mean much, right? But it's the most valuable currency, but it's lost all of its hegemony practically. I mean, like Britain's shadow of what it used to be. The British Empire used to take over, what used to influence most of the world. So that alone debunks his whole point, but he omits that.
I think it's important to note what we mean when we say like a currency is going up or more valuable. It's about trade. It means that British goods and services are expensive if you're another country and you want them. That's what it means. If you want things that are produced in Great Britain, if the pound is up, it means it's going to be expensive to get those things. Same with the dollar, same with anything else. If you have a currency that is weak and devalued, it means it's probably going to be quite easy to get those things. It's inexpensive to bring those things if they're somewhere else. So like that's what it means, right? We're talking about trade. It's not an internal context that internal to the people of the U.S. or Great Britain or somewhere else that dollar is weak to them. No, because that's irrelevant depending on like what you're investing in, what infrastructure you have, what you're trying to accomplish. These things are usually, it's not the same as inflation, as you mentioned, right? It's not prices going up, which is different, right? If you are a U.S. citizen or a person or someone living in the United States, and you have to pay more for things, right? Prices are going up. That is different from the value of the dollar going down in relationship to all of this international exchange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this ties very much into the discussion of inflation. But first, it's maybe worth just clarifying again about the question of borrowing and bonds.
Yeah, we have to go back. We have to ask
because there's so much, because when it comes to borrowing and bonds, I'll just say for the audience who has not seen the MMT videos I did, bonds are savings accounts with the Fed. That's what they are. When you buy a bond, for example, like let's say you decide you want to get a little higher interest, by saving your money instead of a regular bank account, and you don't want the risk associated with the stock market, many people choose to buy bonds. And what is that? It's why would the government, when you're buying a bond, you're not lending the government your money that it's using to spend on military or whatever. Why would it need your money when it can create the US dollar? So first, that's the number one question. Two, that's literally not what's happening. When you buy a bond, it's sitting there with the Fed. It's a savings account, that it pays you interest, which it creates digitally on a keyboard. So that's what it is, right? But I think what can be complicated is that bonds play different roles. Yeah, they play different roles when we were on a gold standard. I also do want to say, though, that even when we were on a gold standard, like the US, taxes did not fund government spending, and if federal government spending. And if you don't believe us, take it from Beardsley Rummel, who was the Federal Reserve chairman in the 1940s in the New Deal era. I think it was under Eisenhower. And he literally wrote a paper called Taxes for Spending Are Obsolete. Like, taxes don't fund government spending. And but when it comes to bonds or savings accounts, the government doesn't need to borrow your money. But I guess what can lead to complications is this was a little bit different in terms of the gold standard when it comes to borrowing. Maybe that's worth clearing up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like the tangent that we went on was important because that set the context for like the gold standard and some international stuff, and that was important as well. As you mentioned, a bond is just a savings instrument that you purchase, and for a person's context, what that means is you took your money and you bought a bond, a savings instrument. Similar to if you have money in your bank account and you move it to a savings account. It's the same thing, right? Your bond will give you some interest, and you'll get that at the end of a certain maturity rate, 10 years, 30 years, etc. For the federal government, what that means is that when you have cash or money, that money is represented with the federal government in one way. If you buy a bond, then that goes into a different kind of account, right? It's like you have a savings account at the Federal Reserve. That's what it means. So that's the important context there. To your point about believing that we have to tax to spend, it's really interesting to think about where we got to that idea and why it became so popular. But really, what it's about, even when we were in the gold standard, it's really about like the fear of deficits and the belief that if you push economists on this, even mainstream ones, they know that you don't need taxes to spend. That's why a deficit is a word. Like the term deficit, federal deficit, exists because you don't need taxes to spend. But what they are
but
really
they're borrowing
afraid
money.
Of, yeah, right. But
from
what
China.
they're really afraid of is the deficit or the debt. They think that is unsustainable, and that it'll bring these problems, right? So to debunk, first of all, the idea of the debt, what people don't understand is it's the way that they're managing interest rates, because they believe the consensus in policy circles and in the government is that they need to play with interest rates and manage them in order to keep inflation where they want it, hit an inflation target. One of the main ways that they manage interest rates is by doing this exchange between the financial centers' reserves and treasury securities from the government's angle. So that means that every time that a deficit increases, so every time that the US government spends more into the economy than it taxes back, that money is going to go into banks. People are going to deposit that money for the most part into banks. Those banks then are going to have more reserves. And if it gets to a point where this is like the part that's complicated and confusing, but it can get to a point where banks have so many reserves that there is no need for a lender of last resort when they exchange reserves with one another. And when that happens, the cost goes down so much that the interest rate is kind of irrelevant between them. So in order to keep that where they want it, the US government will take those reserves out, or what's often called drain those reserves, with treasury securities. So it's like a swap. People in the financial system, banks, etc., they get treasury securities. They get these savings. And they drain out or they lose the reserves that they had with the Fed. That's what's happening. And the reason that's happening when we spend, so that's what people see as borrowing, but it's not borrowing, it's interest rate management in order to keep the interest rate from going down to zero by allowing reserves to accumulate in the financial system. So this is just kind of like convention at this point. So then they will go out into the bond market, sell these treasury securities, drain those reserves, and keep the interest rate where they want it. The net accumulation of all of those treasury securities then is represented as a net savings, and that's the debt. And other countries can have those too. Like when China sends us their exports and we import their stuff, which we can find at Walmart and Target and all these places, that's kind of what they tend to produce and give us, they get dollars for that. And what do they do with these dollars? Well, these Chinese manufacturers get US dollars, they put it in their banks, they have that relationship with their central bank. What are they going to do with those dollars? Well, they would rather take those dollars and buy treasury securities, buy savings instead, because they have no other use for them. And so when you have a treasury security, you have interest on it. And so you get your interest on it. But again, there's no unsustainability or no way that interest goes out of control, because the government can always pay that interest. It's not that's not an issue. That's never been an issue, right? The federal government can never not meet its obligations or its debts when it is denominated in dollars, right? So it's not like we are borrowing from China. We're not like in debt to China. No, we are buying their stuff and they're taking our dollars and buying savings accounts with them. So when you add up all of these savings that are out there, whether it's through other countries or through the draining of reserves, and again, this has been well documented in actual research about central bank operations, right? People like Stephanie Kelton didn't become an MMTer just on, because it sounds cool. They went in to the Federal Reserve, to central banks. They looked at what they actually do. They looked at the history, and this is what happens. So all of those net savings represent the debt, and the money, the money spent into the economy by the U.S. government that hasn't been taxed back yet, like that remainder, is the deficit. These are two different things, which sometimes people just conflate and confuse as one. These are two different things with two different functions, and that tends to be what people think is going to bankrupt the United States or crash the value of the dollar. And that's the major premise under which Dallio's analysis is, which is completely incoherent to what we could call sound macroeconomics, which is not at all how it works. So that I guess understanding that brings us to the question of okay, well, then what is the limit to spending, and what actually causes inflation?
Yeah, you mentioned the debt is really in a record just of the savings, and the borrowing, the quote unquote bonds, right, is really a reflection of the savings. And I've heard MMTers talk about how the debt should actually be renamed to the national savings rate or national savings clock, something like that, instead of the debt, because it's not accurate to call it the debt, national debt, because it's not actually something the government has to pay back. If you paid back the national debt, as people like Ray Dalio imply that we should, you literally drain the entire economy of its money.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that both the debt and the deficit have in common is that if you get rid of those, you drain the economy of all of its money. And when we have run the federal budget as a surplus, and today we're kind of bragging that we're reducing the deficit and the debt. What we're doing is we're actually draining money out of the economy and pushing people towards like real debt for them. Like, again, the government's deficit is not, it has a mirror image to the public's debts and deficits. So if the government's going into a surplus and reducing its deficit and all these things, that means the public is being pushed towards household debt, corporate debt, etc., private debt, etc., etc. That's a real problem. That's unsustainable because we can't issue our own money. We have to work for it. That's dangerous. So it's a different issue. Now, MMTers are not necessarily like in alignment with continuing that policy of draining reserves in order to manage interest rates and just paying that interest on those bonds as standard practice for deficit spending. One, because it's kind of like a free subsidy to bondholders, and the majority of bondholders are very wealthy, powerful people and with financial interests, whatever, right? The second reason is because we think interest rate management as monetary policy is completely stupid and doesn't do anything, and doesn't do anything productive, I should say, can do very destructive things. So what you'll hear from MMTers is a proposition to just leave interest rates at zero, and this is called permanent zero interest rate policy, PZIRP, and seek to manage and stabilize prices in a different way and in a better way.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think what we can use this as the opportunity to get to inflation. Because, well, actually, before I get to inflation, I have to say one of the things that Ray Dalio implies is that the U.S. will lose its hegemony and status as a global superpower once it defaults on its debts. And he says this literally. And his implication, his solution that we think we should do to prevent this is essentially some sort of centrist neoliberal technocracy that imposes austerity, because he says that we need to cut back on spending. We need to take in more than we spend, which basically involves the government deleting a lot of money out of the economy, which why would you do that unless you're an idiot? But the just first one, let's get first, like, is it possible for the U.S. to default on its debts?
It's impossible for the U.S. to unwillingly default on its debts. I mean, it can willingly do so because it's just a decision to do so.
It can just erase having bonds. Like, theoretically, they can just decide not to have bonds.
I mean, yeah, we can just theoretically just implode. But that's a whole other conversation. But if we don't want to, we just cannot, by definition, default on our debts, because we can always just spend the money. And even mainstream people know this at the bottom of the day. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between most economists on these things, but the mainstream people kind of know this. It's more of the kind of cranks, which Dallio starts to definitely align with, that think like a big default is coming, or something like that, right? And I think the other important piece to note here is that this is where rhetoric that seems just economic on the surface starts to become very connected to social issues and historical issues, not as like a bunch of empires competing to be at the top, and Dallio kind of posturing as like he gets like how dominance is established, and history just being exclusively and inevitably about who's the most powerful and is going to dominate or whatever. But Like, truly, what happens when you use austerity or cut back or spend less to people that live in that country? Like, I think there's a tendency for a certain kind of cultural milieu to be really into the kind of stuff that Dallio's video talks about. Conventionally, I think it's been kind of like very bro-ish. And by that, it's like, the people most likely to seek a career in finance themselves, or to have very kind of conservative views themselves, very individualistic based ideologically, little incentives to think about things holistically or community wise or etc., which more times than not, right, tend to be like white guys, simply because history has been designed to favor that group the most. And the people that have been most impacted by a lack of infrastructure, a lack of spending, the distribution of rights unequally, a kind of asymmetrical or unfair participation in society. I mean, this falls on other people, right? It falls on the descendants of slavery. It falls on the people that lost their land to American westward expansion. It falls on women and their position in society through most of history. It falls on the descendants of Mexicans who lost their land. It falls on immigrants who were displaced in their countries, oftentimes through American foreign policy or through other, kind of terrible things happening, who are just seeking a better life, right? Like, these distributions of unfairness, of exclusion, of depravity, of abandonment falls in communities. I mean, like, why do ghettos exist? Why do we call them ghettos, and why do they exist? Because, like, there are places that got segregated intentionally through policy and then never received any kind of support. So all of this lack of investment and care, really, it's really care, infrastructural, institutional care that other groups did receive, credit, public money, public rights, protection, all this sort of stuff, right? A lot of groups didn't receive. So when we're talking about austerity, when we're talking about this kind of cultural righteousness of cutting back and sound finance, yeah, that might work well for somebody that's either already rich or trying to be in finance, or, trying to like flex in that sort of kind of cultural space. But for the people that have historically been screwed over, their unemployment's going to go up the most. They're not going to receive the kind of whether it's services, whether it's basic infrastructure, whether it's schools, whether it's job opportunities, that's not going to be there. So they're the people that are going to suffer. And that's bullshit, right? It's bullshit to kind of like take this grandiose position that the environment's going to suffer, right? All of these things that are connected to kind of capitalist, industrial, economic development is the consequences and the results of cutting back on this kind of spending. So I guess this goes back also to the gold standard mentality of like, if we forced some kind of finite imposition on money and then make it seem like it's the responsible thing to do, then, it's just practically impossible to have a fair democracy, to have some kind of sustainable or just society, if you force austerity or arbitrary limits on investment.
Yeah, it's very well said. And this is very antithetical to the sort of policies that Ray Dalio advocates for, which I want to take a moment just to elaborate on. It's really funny to me how Ray Dalio seems to live in a world of his own, because he says, number one, he advocates essentially, without saying, that we need neoliberal technocracy that needs to push back on austerity. That needs to impose austerity by taking in more than we spend. But he also says in the same breath that he acknowledges that the USA suffers from an education deficit and that we need to spend more on education. And he points how, even a lot countries that are much poorer have better quality education than the USA, and that requires spending. He also talks about how the USA's infrastructure is crumbling apart, and you see that even Biden's like modest $3 trillion package to rebuild America's infrastructure, which was half of what Bernie Sanders' $6.5 million, I believe, proposal for rebuilding infrastructure was. And okay, you want to rebuild infrastructure and you want to balance the budget, pick one. You can't do both.
Right,
So
exactly.
His analysis is super contradictory. And he also, what I see, he lives in a world of his own. I'm not kidding. He says that very naively, in my opinion, that what America needs is more of a moderate bipartisanship government where you have both Republicans and Democrats elected, and that they can just work out their differences and do what's best for the common good. And it's like, Dallio, you realize that both parties are funded by you, by people like you. He's like so oblivious, like bipartisanship. They not. I mean, I do think it's oblivious. I don't think it's just, he's lying. I think he's generally just lives in his own world like a lot of rich people do, because these parties play off each other and are financed by big interest groups. So what do you mean bipartisanship? And he says that we need to keep the radicals out. We need to keep out left populism and right populism, falsely equating the two things, and we need more moderate government. That's what we've had for the last like 60 years. I don't know what planet this guy is living on.
Yeah. It's very strange. Yeah.
It's just this whole time. I also listened to his interviews to see, like, I didn't want to take him out of context. I wanted to see, does he say the same things in his interviews? And he really does. But it's a very, while, like you pointed out with the fancy animations and the kind of friendly vibe he gives off in the videos, it can seem almost like it's just, I'm just above politics and I'm wise and I want to reach out to the common man. But beneath his analysis is a very elitist neoliberal technocratic ideology. And you can see the way he talks about, also when he talks about China and the USA, the aspects he seems to like about China are, in my opinion, its worst aspects. Like he talks about how China can get things done faster because he talks about how the two-party system, it creates incentives where they both want to spend a lot of money and no one wants to get elected. You have to spend more money, so they keep increasing the deficit. Whereas China, has much more stringent rule, and that's really not true even on the face of it, because China has a massive debt too. Spends a lot of money. It may not, their debt to GDP isn't nearly as high as the USA because their GDP is so high, right? So their debt to GDP isn't as high, but they still have a massive debt, and they're used for years. I remember neoclassical economists talking about how China will default on its debt, how they'll run out of money, and all these ridiculous things. So I don't know, his analysis is just so incredibly contradictory, but I think another part we can really go into depth on is his analysis of inflation, right? Because he talks about how almost just, if you print more money, you have more inflation. And then if you have inflation, you have to raise interest rates. Okay, for those who are not MMT pilled yet, why does spending more money not lead to inflation? And actually, what are the causes of inflation today? A big question, I know, but maybe I think one leads to the other, because it's such a relevant discussion today, because everyone now for some reason thinks that as inflation gets higher, that MMT is more and more wrong, which is weird.
Yeah, I mean, so it really, I think, is the question that comes down to when we're thinking about the economy, when we're thinking about all of these policy questions. It really comes down to a matter of price stability, which I think is my preferred way to talk about inflation, because clearly something does happen. There have been examples of currencies just being incapable of having much purchasing power. It's a real phenomenon. And as MMTers will all tell you, the real constraint on spending is an inflationary constraint that might destabilize prices. And to find out exactly why this happens is what's key. So the first kind of thing you'll hear from MMTers is that inflation is a resource constraint. It's important to understand the difference between this way of viewing things and the mainstream way, or what Dallio might think, which, to kind of reiterate, right, it's just that if you spend too much, if you print too much, because only scarce things can be valuable, and because money is inherently a scarce commodity, therefore spending too much will make that thing lose its value. It really kind of does feel like, in a magical kind of fantasy way, a dollar bill all of a sudden like loses its worth, like inside to it or something. It's very weird, because any kind of like, I don't know, like basic sociological or just any kind of depth of thought would, I think, lead one to understand that it's not the money itself, it's the prices. And that prices, well, a lot of these mainstream folks think that prices are just they're discovered, they're imminent to the economy. They markets themselves as like a thing, a creature, give us prices, and we just find them and discover them, right? So that's what they believe. So of course, if too much money in the economy would make these markets not work at their equilibrium levels, right? But I mean, we know that this is all nonsense, because prices are actually set, and people that work in business actually know this too. Industries set prices, corporate boards set prices. Oftentimes, unions working with management set prices. Lobbyists and legislation together with industry help set prices, right? Prices are something that is figured out by people in order to, deal with costs and make some kind of a margin and a return. But sometimes that can be sacrificed to maintain customer loyalty and to maybe get out of a slump. It all depends, right? Like, there's no like iron law about what a price should be. It's not just, two lines meeting at an equilibrium in terms of marginal, the most one, like you learn in Econ 101 where it's like the most somebody would pay to buy something, that's where the price is. In real business and real industry, nobody's got time for this shit. And it's impossible to have all this information anyways. So it's just coordinated by people.
Yeah, the neoclassical economics very much engages in the process of mystification to hide that prices are basically socially constructed by people with the power to set prices. Like, they look at it as when supply and the equilibrium between supply and demand, when it's just prices are set by the price setters. And the government can change that very easily with price controls or setting prices itself. There's all sort of ways to change this, but they kind of see it as inflation rather being a process of price setters, and the government being the most powerful price setter is just this process of, as you spend more money, the line goes up.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of seeing prices go up because money lost its value because too much money in the economy, MMTers will point out that this is a question of resources and full employment. So if a country's employment was at the maximum and all resources were being used up, that could be a situation where prices would start to get pressures to increase. Why? Because that might start leading to scarcity of not of money, of things, right? Or what I should say, shortages, or competition amongst price fights over like getting access to resources and things like that. So that's one way that we can think about inflation, right? Like, how much space is there in an industry or in the economy as a whole to be able to handle what a specific kind of spending would do? If we spent on giving everybody healthcare in this country, Medicare for all, right? What would that do to the healthcare industry and the resources in that industry that are necessary for it to accomplish what that goal is? So that's that, right? And like there we have to think about questions not of just, okay, well, if we're going over the limit, we obviously have to stop spending. Not necessarily, because spending is creative, and so spending increases capacity as well. So, this just has to be thought out in a more nuanced way. We need more data that people will often try to like pressure me or an MM here to like show them exactly what the exact number is on how much we can spend or not spend. And that's so stupid, because like right now we have like all of these agencies, the CBO, etc., who do get paid money and live, well as bureaucrats to give us, data on debt projections and all this kind of shit, right? We need to repurpose all of this to give us data on the actual state of the economy. So that's one thing, right? Also, there are shocks that can come to an economy, like a global pandemic, for example, that can have consequences and an impact on the systems, the supply chains, the logistical systems, the workers, the infrastructure that is supposed to deliver all of these goods and services. And if that gets affected, then we're going to have shortages, we're going to have bottlenecks in industry, we're going to have time issues. A lot of industry has been made to be a what's called a just-in-time system. And that just-in-time system was very vulnerable to something like a pandemic. Furthermore, we had to close down a bunch of economies to avoid mass death, which we still kind of experienced, but it would have been way worse. And in closing and then reopening, right, the logical thing would have been to have passed Build Back Better to offer the stimulus so that we could get our infrastructure back in shape and not have these price issues right now. But because we didn't do that, the opposite of Dallio's thinking, right, which would have been just like, cut back, we're spending too much. And even like Bill Maher, who said something really stupid a few days ago.
I hate Bill Maher. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's for another day.
That's for another day altogether. Contrary to that line of thinking, Build Back Better would have actually put money into strengthening infrastructure and all of these sorts of things, which would have then avoided some of the worst problems of supply chains in the U.S. Some of this stuff is international as well, because our economies are internationally connected, and so we have to coordinate, a better vaccine rollout for the whole world. And I think lastly, also, we need to start thinking about how serious the fossil fuel economy is as a threat to price stability. Whether it's war and the consequences of war and imperialism, such as what's happening with the Russia crisis at the moment, and that those effects on getting oil to different countries, whether it's just the volatility of that industry, oil is running out, the effects of oil obviously on climate change and the environment, the military incentive that countries have towards controlling oil, like that's a huge problem for price stability that's only going to get worse. So starting to think about transitioning to renewable energy is also a way to stabilize prices.
You know what matters more than climate change? Paying back our digital currency. Yes. Digital blips on a screen. That's what matters more.
That's what's...
It is crazy to me how he does this analysis of the changing world order and not even consider how climate change would change the world order, and how you would prioritize austerity over, the fact of the matter is that things like the Green New Deal, which frankly we need, I think honestly the Green New Deal is too modest, but even that is very expensive, and we're gonna have to pay. Like it's the government, as long as it's in the government's own currency, the government can pay for whatever is in its own currency. Like China didn't ask how we're going to pay for it when they built their massive railway system. Or you see, like when it comes to debt, my favorite thing is how sometimes, you mentioned that mainstream economists will often, when you press them, they'll admit that taxes don't fund government spending, or that they don't fund all of government spending. And they'll say, yeah, because we run deficits, of course. But then they'll say, deficits are fine, but you can't get too much. Okay, what's too much? Because you see Japan, right, has by far the largest deficit, as I think 250% of GDP, debt to GDP, by far the highest deficit, right? Most debt, and deflation. It doesn't even have inflation. It's trying to have inflation, and it can't. So it's like,
it's trying to have inflation. You just can't get it.
Yeah, and that's hilarious. That it's incredible, because even I think a lot of econ departments have stopped teaching the quantity theory of money. So it's weird that Ray Dalio.
They have like that new kind of new Keynesian thing, where like the Krugman stuff is popular, where it's just like you can run some deficits when you're like crashing and burning, but as soon as you're in good times again, you got to run a surplus and balance those budgets. That's kind of like their line of thinking.
Why? It's really ridiculous. And one thing that I think is really interesting is how he also seems to assume, I know this is kind of departs from the monetary discussion a little bit, but he also equates democracy and authoritarianism kind of like in this banal way, and he kind of assumes that the USA is like all democracy is or can be. And he thinks it's like a trade-off. Oh, there's pros and cons to authoritarianism, democracy. Actually, the problem is we don't have enough democracy. Right. Like, and I think he has this very technocratic view, like almost the way the founding fathers did, that the plebs don't know what's best for them. You just let a couple of smart elites control, and they'll get our finances in order. It's sort of his view.
Agreed. I mean, I think that, and I would also say that I would suspect that Dallio, like many others, would claim that they're not technocrats in some circumstances, because they would say like, oh, well, if you want the government to spend and do like more socialized kind of planning, that would say that a bunch of government bureaucrats know better than the market, right? And the market is truly democratic. So, it's also kind of like that having your cake and eating it too situation, where depending on the context is what position they'll take.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that, again, it's in speaking about democracy, it's always ignoring the major lacks of democracy that the U.S. has had, which has to do with the economy, like workers, women, and minorities. That's never spoken to, and yet it's like a huge part of our history. And I mean, like, these things are connected, right? And that's why, of course, like today, there's so much resistance by right-wing groups to some of the victories that the political victories and civil rights and other things that were achieved in the mid 20th century. So, like, most books on the New Deal, for example, will, or at least like good books worth reading, even by liberals, will kind of say, okay, there was fascism and authoritarianism in many parts of the world becoming popular, including critiques of Stalinism, but the United States, I'm thinking of the book Fear Itself, which is not written by a radical by any means, but a huge part, they handle the tension between the U.S. trying to preserve democracy as such with its own anti-democratic like impulses and betrayals, because a big part of the New Deal was passed by working with the South to reduce democracy and enforce a racial caste system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really fascinating, right? And it goes to your point that, like, you can't think of democracy as like a single homogenous thing, right? Like there are fights to try to make democracy better and more democracy, and I think we have very little democracy in a meaningful sense still.
But what we need is bipartisanship. We need to team up with the party that's trying to engage in voter suppression. That's what we need.
Right.
But, you mentioned FDR, and speaking of the New Deal, one thing that Ray Dalio hints at is that class warfare is a threat to political stability and can be the downfall of empires. Obviously, such as the Russian Empire, the Qin Dynasty. Various powers, right? And of course, I've heard him talk about this before. He talks about class warfare from his very bourgeois position, like class war is bad, it's instability. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. I mean, at least he acknowledges class war. I'll give him that. He's better than the likes of Steven Pinker, who will think, "Oh, what do you mean class warfare? Everybody is fine." Or so much better. At least he acknowledges it. But the funny thing to me is how he talks. He does acknowledge that FDR helped kind of quell the class war that was intensifying, and then after the 1929 crash with the New Deal, and he seems to be okay with that. It's hard to tell whether he thinks they spent too much money or that going off the gold standard was bad. But he does kind of credit FDR for quelling the class war. And he talks about how class war is getting worse now with the far right and the far left increasing. He kind of falsely equates them. But his solution seems to be austerity, and that we need to spend less money. Okay, pick one, dude. If you were to raise interest rates and balance the budget, that'd be a gift to, like, well, I don't know. I think it would be potentially a gift to Marxists and fascists, but not to equate them. Obviously, like, I'm pro-Marxist, but I like, it's not helping his case. Like, if he wants there not to be class war and instability, everything he's hinting towards would make that a whole lot worse. I mean, his analysis is just contradictory even for his own goals. So it's bad for a bourgeois analysis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I am not somebody that wants to exacerbate class war to its final. Like, I'm not an accelerationist, and I don't think that.
Yeah, me neither. I don't think immiseration automatically leads to communism. It can just as easily lead to fascism, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, like, fascism is a much more likely scenario because we don't even know what the fuck communism means. Like, at least in my opinion, like, it's still in kind of like this, an abstract analysis of what it might mean because of what Marx wrote in the 19th century and whatever. I mean, we've seen what fascism does. Okay, like, we've seen what that is. We know what ethno-nationalism is. We know what they can do. We have no idea. And I mean, I think this is another conversation, but there are a lot of critiques about, like, the kind of quote unquote scientific socialism that Marxism says will lead to communism, and there are issues with that. And while I don't equate, a leftist populist with a right-wing populist by any means, I would definitely worry that class warfare antagonisms would get to the point where things are all breaking down because, there is no guarantee that anything would be more progressive or democratic. And
especially in the United States.
Especially in the United States. Given our history, something I learned from being a supporter of the Bernie Sanders campaign both times was that there were still a ton of people in that campaign who had, like, reactionary impulses, and I'm obviously glad that they were on that side. But as soon as that campaign lost, it all came out, and we're seeing it now, like, with people like Jimmy Dore and all these people who were, like, supposedly Bernie supporters and whatever. And as soon as that candidate was gone, they took their opportunism straight to the far right, and there's a whole little faction of these people who are kind of trying to sanitize Tucker Carlson. So there's a lot of danger to that. But anyways, to your point, yes, like, if you actually cared about not wanting class antagonisms or just antagonisms in general, because I think, like, there is some differentiation to be made between other forms of antagonisms too that are related to but not reducible to class, you absolutely want to fucking spend some money and build some infrastructure and raise quality of life and create a more fair economy and create a more democratic, balanced economy and increase the quality of life for workers and reduce racial tensions and all this sort of stuff. Like, that's what you would want. So yes, Ray Dalio, if you're listening, your austerity is going to almost guarantee that we have an explosion of class antagonism and warfare.
It's crazy how he analyzes all that's happened and comes to the conclusion that we need more centrism. I mean, it's just so tone deaf. It's like Bill Maher level tone deaf. And what's worse is this guy wrote a whole book and didn't seem to learn anything. And it's quite incredible because really, I would argue from a kind of more Marxian perspective is that, and I am not anti-electoral. Like, I'm not, for example, think, because FDR did save capitalism, but I wouldn't have been against the New Deal. Like, I'm at the end of the day, I think it's a huge progress. And actually, I would say that if the 60s and 70s are kind of proof, especially the late 60s, it's sort of proof that actually as the economy gets better, you actually have more opportunity for activism, which is not the way we're used to thinking about it. We're sometimes used to thinking about it as immiseration leads to revolution, and that's not necessarily true. It could lead to the wrong kind of revolution too, as we saw in Germany.
Right.
So I would say, if I was to advise a benevolent despot what to do to save the American empire, it would be basically implement Bernie Sanders' policies without saying it was socialism. That would be the smartest thing. If you were to take Ray Dalio's advice and say, if you want to keep the things, they would probably want to keep empire realistically, like for them, their interests, because they're imperialists. Ray Dalio is not anti-US empire by any means. He would basically implement something like universal health care plan, jobs guarantee, or a bunch of policies that would basically, mitigate the class warfare and keep the system going. But he's not even smart enough to come to that conclusion. Whereas, Roosevelt in today's money, I believe, was billionaire, like very wealthy family. And he saw it as, and he was actually in the minority of the bourgeoisie. There was people much worse. But he saw that, to mitigate the class warfare, that you had to prevent the rise of either communism or fascism, you had to give people some breadcrumbs. You had to give people a larger piece of the economic pie. And it's not new either. You saw, benevolent despots, like real benevolent despots. I'm not saying Roosevelt was a despot per se, but Bismarck would be a benevolent despot. Was the first to implement Social Security, and he even called it National Socialism. He was the first to actually invent that term. And, what's funny to me is, obviously, as a Marxist, I don't think this is the end-all be-all of politics. Like, I think these people saved capitalism. But at least, it's funny to me that people like Ray Dalio can study world orders and notice that the system he benefits from is in danger, and not come to the obvious conclusion that you need to give people a slice of pie. And the other, he just comes to basically more or less what I would say, what his vision actually is kind of what Biden's doing. Like, Biden's trying to balance the budget, and it's not successful at all. Like, if anything, people are more angrier than ever at the Biden administration. And I think it's going to give Republicans a big advantage in the midterms. Things are not looking good. And I mean, I don't know how anyone could look at that Ray Dalio video and say, we need this kind of information. This is what we need.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the importance of culture and ideology in understanding politics, which is something that, for whatever reason, the Anglo-American left and the Anglo-Saxon world in general is really bad at. I mean, I guess it makes sense if you think about it, but people believe things for many reasons, and ideology has a heavy weight on how people kind of structure what they support and how they learn what they choose to believe and not to believe, and how they, I guess, organize their political alliances. If it was strictly for avoiding, mass populism, I think Ray Dalio would both be against austerity for a lot of public programs and also anti-imperialism for anyone, because that also causes, it's the same thing. I mean, whether it's just like huge refugees, immigration issues,
Oh yeah.
world instability, all these kinds of things come from that as well, right? And so like if I mean, like, Dallio seems
that's
kind
worth
of like,
actually touching on, especially like the refugee crisis as a consequence of imperialism and colonialism, especially in like France and England and Europe are facing this, and they're talking about all these refugees and complaining about the decline of Western civilization and not realize how this is directly a product of their imperialism.
Yeah, and so Dallio kind of seems like a bit of a classical liberal in many senses, and part of that classical liberal fantasy and ideal is to have world stability and peace in a certain kind of way, but it is impossible with certain dominant ideologies, policies, world orders, as his video suggests, etc. I think that there are many forms of imperialism in the world. It's not just the United States. I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make, that anything that's against the United States is anti-imperialist. I think that's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But
France
I think there's
is
a
still
lot of work.
imperialist. In Africa.
Yeah, and then there's different forms of different there are imperialisms or hegemonies that have different goals in mind. Some of them far more right-wing and authoritarian than others. And that doesn't justify the the terrible things that are done by the West. It just means that things are complicated. And that if we want a more democratic society, I mean, we got to expand in a more stable society, a more peaceful society, a more equal society. Even if, right, let's say, like, even if it doesn't mean like Dallio becoming, somebody in the working class, and let's say he's still going to be a rich guy. Maybe he'll lose a substantial part of his power and wealth, but he'll still be a pretty rich guy. I still think progress can be made as that some kind of middle ground towards a like unrecognizable society for today, even though that things are so bad that even that might be unrecognizable. But we need to expand the things that we want for the United States towards domestic minorities and the international community. And so that means thinking about, like, after World War II, people like Keynes were talking about a new world order based on a Keynes plan, which would have included a global currency and agreements between countries that those that were going to be net importers and net exporters. At the end of the day, this international currency would balance things out so that unemployment could be addressed in countries that would ultimately have a bigger issue on unemployment. So in the same way that the dual mandate is price stability and full employment, I think that we need to do the same thing at an international level. And that would mean pressuring the West and the Western powers to let go of some of their imperialist impulses that remain to this day, but also to do so, at least in my opinion, without giving in to the certain populist nationalisms that are also on the rise and being spurred by kind of the ideology of Putin and Trump and some of these folks, Le Pen, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one big irony within Ray Dalio's analysis is within it lies a profound fear that the American empire will decline, which I see as a good thing, especially for Latin America. But the irony of it is that Ray Dalio's implications as to how to prevent this from being the case is actually how I think would lead to the decline of the American empire. Like, for example, if I were to say how would the American empire decline? Well, first of all, is not listening to the people. First of all, is by austerity, more centrism, more compromise between the different bourgeois politicians, especially since I think what Ray Dalio views as moderate, I think, is actually to the right of Biden, which is insane because I would say Biden is like centrist moderate, but I think his idea of moderate is like Bill Clinton, which should be even more right wing. And the irony is that I think this would, number one, it would be worse for class warfare. It would also just be worse for the US's economy in general, because you would be really running the US at its US's economy below its capacity, because you'd be spending way less money. You'd be running it way below capacity, and you would take a lot of money out of the economy, and you would sacrifice a lot of economic growth. And this would lead to the exact things he fears, which is, that populism, the right-wing populism and the left-wing populism, which to really emphasize, like what he calls left-wing populism, Bernie Sanders, is what I think would actually line up closer to his solutions for having a compromise with the people to avoid class warfare. But he obviously is too oblivious to say that. But that being said, this is really all I have left to say on my notes when it comes to Ray Dalio's problematic analysis. One thing I'll add, and then I'll ask you if you have any last thoughts and things to critique about the video. One thing I'll say, though, is generally all attempts to kind of paint history as a series of cycles that are internal, that this history is the same process happening over and over again, and it's these inevitable cycles, almost like transcendental laws that are just created by nature, are always fall flat. Like these big history books, there's been a lot of big history books written that try to say stuff like that. Like there's Noah Harari is one of those thinkers who tends to portray history this way, rather than what it really is, which is history is always changing, and we're progressing and regressing at the same time in different ways, and different countries going through their different. But instead of that, Ray Dalio tries to homogenize history through grand narratives to fit really what is the dominant ideology, which is why I think it's not. I can't even call Ray Dalio's analysis far right or anything. It's much more boring than that. It's the conventional, it's the conventional neoclassical view. Nothing profound about it at all. But with that being said, Andres, is there anything you'd like to add as to critiques of the video and things people should know?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll close out with a couple observations. I definitely agree with you about trying to homogenize history and the problem with that. I think there may very well be some patterns to life and history that are circular, but that doesn't mean they're identically circular as Dallio and some of these grand narrative people try to suggest, right? Like that there's like it's the same internal laws happening over again, when in fact, like kind of just like a person's life can be circular, you're never in an identical state, and there's always room to do things differently, to learn, to move in different directions. There's always contingencies and spaces available. The second thing I'd say is that the lesson about societies falling and collapsing, the alternative, I should say, to Dallio's analysis, which is like, don't spend too much money. And he does kind of, I think, speak to inequality, which is, again, weird, and it goes to your point on like the contradictions he makes. But really, societies collapse when elites become so entrenched in their power, and suffering and resentment and exclusion and isolation become so great for people that it becomes unsustainable. So it's kind of greed by people who occupy the same class as Dallio that leads to society's collapse, in addition to a relationship to the environment and to ecologies that are exploitative and predatory, and that don't have kind of an intentionality behind how and why we use resources and the natural environment and interact with it. So surely industrial capitalism and its exploitation of the environment, its refusal and stubbornness to transition to a far more efficient and generative energy system around renewables, is also part of what would make modern contemporary societies collapse. And then lastly, it's like, why the hell would we keep doing an analysis as if empires have to be the model? As if the only way to think about society and history is like a bunch of competing empires. I mean, maybe that's the problem. Maybe the problem is that empire is an unsustainable system, period. Right? That like one nation or one group of people or one class or whatever dominating everybody else, carrying the responsibility of having to do everything right and having all the power, and everybody kind of responding to them as an empire. Like, that's the problem, right? And we need to like figure out how to have a much more inclusive, democratic, accountable type of social system that at the very least guarantees dignity. Right? You can have leadership. This is at least my position, right? I think, we'll always have there isn't flat equality in the world, but we can still have political equality. But people are different.
Yeah, Marx said that too. Marx wasn't for everybody completely equal all the time. It was classless, which is different than fully equal, right?
Right. So people are different. People have different skills. People are better at different things, whatever. Some people are more kind of inclined to be leaders and whatever. So we can have like equality to some inequality in some sense. That sounds fine to me. And kind of leadership and authority I think is necessary too. But and there will surely be problems and conflicts in any society. But we can definitely use far more accountability to that, far more transparency, and most importantly, a significant amount of guaranteed dignity for everybody, so that people being powerful and having a life they can enjoy doesn't have to structurally come at the expense of misery, which is what we see today.
Very well said. Yeah, within Dallio's analysis lies a sort of also Machiavellian neorealism that there will always be empires, no matter what. And he just takes this for granted that there'll always be a new empire, and that's how life works and whatnot. And I'm really happy you brought that up, because that's another huge problem in his analysis, and it's these assumptions. And it's ultimately one aspect of one-dimensional thought is not questioning basic assumptions. That's what we try to do on this podcast and on the channel, and what we tried to do today. So I really hope the listeners enjoyed this talk, and I really hope that it'll help you be able to debunk these sort of assumptions when you see them in videos or in conversations. And it was great to have you on, Andres. I think it was fantastic, very educational. And I would highly encourage people to follow you on Twitter and follow all the links I provided in the description. And anything else you'd like to add?
Just want to thank you for having me on the show. And it was a pleasure.
For sure, man. All right. And if you enjoy this podcast, please give it a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to this. And if you want exclusive podcasts, I have about 14 of them now available on Patreon only. So you get something if you become a patron and support the show. So hopefully the listeners enjoy. And peace out.